welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Well, thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a new week of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday. It is the 9th day of September in the year 2019. It is a pleasure to welcome you to a new week of broadcasting. We are live today, and we will be live tomorrow because tomorrow we have a special guest. Kevin Shanley will be with us. We rescheduled him. As you'll recall, we had to cancel at the last moment last week Kevin's appearance. It was scheduled a week ago Wednesday, and we had to cancel it. So we rescheduled for tomorrow, Tuesday. Kevin dropped me an email yesterday and said he was ready to go. He's primed to go. So again, I can't exactly tell you what Kevin is going to say. But I can tell you that he's been focusing on the China relationship with Hong Kong and the protests that have been going on in Hong Kong. The concession that was made to the protesters just toward the end of last week to withdraw the piece of legislation that sparked the protests. But at least up to this point, withdrawing it hasn't had a material effect on the protests. It seems that the protests have kind of developed a life of their own. There seems to be more to it than the particular piece of legislation that set the entire demonstrations off initially. There's much more substance to it now. And so, if anything, I think that the withdrawal of this particular piece of legislation was a little bit too little, too late. I think I'm kind of reminded of the American Revolution with this. Once you go beyond a certain point, it's a little bit difficult to turn back. And I think that's partly the story. But we'll hear from Kevin tomorrow. So, I look forward to hearing from him so much, and at the same time, as I mentioned before, I get a little bit nervous because I want to be able to contribute whatever I can to the conversation and maybe point it towards particular issues and things. But until I hear Kevin deliver and know what those issues are, I can't prepare. So all I can do is eagerly worry with you about tomorrow's program. I'm not worried about it. I'm actually looking forward to it. But at the same time, it's one of those things that you really can't prepare for ahead of time. But anyway, I wanted to mention that, and I'll try to remember to mention it at the beginning of our second hour as well. So if you have friends or colleagues, especially people who have been following the China story and the Hong Kong story, you may want to alert them to tomorrow's program. Let me also encourage you to share your thoughts with us here on our program today, and hopefully again on Wednesday as well. We have an 800 number that allows you to call into the studios. And you may recall during our programs last week, the 800 number was down temporarily. And Bob Kincaid informed us that even if the number is down, people can contact us live through Skype. I said that, I reported that on the air to our listeners. I have to acknowledge very honestly that if that was me, I wouldn't know how to do that. But most people aren't quite as illiterate when it comes to technology as I am. But Be that as it may, I'm going to give you the 800 number, and I did forget to ask Agnes early on if it was working again. But the number, many of you remember it anyway, it's 844 the horn. That's 844 the horn. So if you'd like to, come on the air with us and share your thoughts with us, we would love to hear from you. And so let me basically point out, you've got two options. You can use the 800 number, and if that doesn't work, then you can basically come on the air with us via Skype. However you choose to do it, I want you to know ahead of time that we look forward to hearing from you. If you'd like to send me a comment on the program or the issues that we raise here at the program, you can do that in one of two ways. You can either send me an email, or you can put a message directly to me via our Facebook page. If you are inclined to go the email route, then let me give you my email address. It is waobrien906@gmail.com. All of that is one word, no punctuation, lowercase. waobrien906@gmail.com. I have to say that about no punctuation because the name O'Brien has an apostrophe in it. But when you're using the email address, there is no apostrophe. There's no punctuation at all. Just waobrien906, lowercase. But again, you can send me the email at waobrien906@gmail.com, or you can use our Facebook page. Just go to our Facebook page, go to the homepage, facebook.com, and in the search box at the top of the homepage, type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, and you'll be onto our Facebook page, and you'll see a number of postings there. I have to acknowledge, and I'll later on explain why, but it's been a bit of time. It's been a while since I put a new posting on Facebook. And part of the reason for that is I've been working on a project, which I'll get to later in our program today. But I intend to plan to do more of that. But again, if you do go to our Facebook page, all the postings that are on there have this feature. And that is, at the end of each posting, there are two computer links. There's a share link and a comment link. If you click on the share link, it sends that particular posting to all the friends all your friends on your Facebook account. So that gives us much wider exposure, and of course for that we would be very grateful. The other link is a comment link, and if you click on that, it gives you the opportunity to make a comment directly to me, similar to an email. Ostensibly, because the comment link is attached to a particular posting, Facebook's assumption is that the comment you make will be related to the posting itself. And while that can be, it doesn't necessarily have to be true. Once you make the comment and I look at the comment, I'll know immediately what you're referring to, because I will will remember or realize that it's related to an issue that we touched upon here at the Virtual Center during one of our recent programs. So the point is, we would love to hear from you, and we hope that you will avail yourself of the opportunity and the advantages of doing this. All of us continue to read in various places about the need for dialogue, the need for conversation. We have more and more need in our society to talk to each other. Yesterday, for example, my wife and I packed up a picnic basket and went to our place in the country, actually Wilma's place in the country, and had a picnic. And it was just the two of us, and it was a beautiful day. And we sat and enjoyed our lunch and enjoyed each other, enjoyed the conversation. We were there for about almost 3 hours, about 2 hours and 45 minutes. And we were both commenting as we drove back that our whole perspective on the day had changed. That on the way down, we were talking about problems. On the way back, we were talking about what a wonderful day we were having. I guess the point I'm trying to make is we need to talk to each other more and more and more, not just within families, but within communities, within neighborhoods, within states, within the nation. I'm reading an article, and I haven't quite finished it yet, on higher education. And the focus of it, and I haven't, as I say, I've only gone about a third of the way through it. But the issue at hand is the issue of dialogue and debate in our college and university classrooms. And the extent to which many people are complaining, are pointing out that it's more and more difficult as the years go by to find college classes where actual debate and open discussion happens. And different groups of people, in other words, groups with an agenda, have their own explanations for this. Conservatives, for some time, have been alleging that our college and university campuses are run by liberals and that college education has become more of an indoctrination into socialist thinking and socialist ideas than it is in education. Other people point out other factors which might be responsible for this. But the fact of the matter is, whatever the venue, whatever the topic, it seems to me there's a genuine consensus within the nation that we need to talk to each other more. How many times have you heard, I know I've heard, about families that go out to dinner and you look at the table in a restaurant where the entire family is sitting at the same table, and most members, if not all members of the family, are on their phones. They're communicating with cyberspace. They're not looking across the table and communicating with the important person sitting on the other side of that table. And it's affecting our society. It's having an impact. Because very honestly, if we don't communicate, we can't learn from each other. And I think most of the experts, when it comes to educational theory, will acknowledge that communication and education go hand in hand. And I've mentioned this numerous times on this program because I've long been very suspicious of these online classes and online entire programs online where education theoretically is delivered to every to the kitchen table of every individual in the country who wants it. Well, the fact of the matter is it's not education that's being delivered, it's information. The education is what happens when people engage that information. The problem is if you're in the house by yourself, you have nobody to engage with. You have nobody to communicate with. You have nobody to point out the strengths and or weaknesses of your train of thought. You have nobody willing to give you an alternative point of view on what you have already formulated your own thinking about. All of this is necessary. I think our nation needs it. Our people need it. Our political system needs it. So that's really why these numbers and communication vehicles that I take the time at the beginning of the program each day to share with you are important, because the interaction is important. And I wanted to make that point at the beginning of the program. Got a number of things today that, and as we usually do, after we haven't been together for 4 or 5 days, a lot of things happen. I'm struck, at least I was struck earlier today, as I was surveying the media and both broadcast media and print media. There's no question that the big story going into this week is the canceled meeting, heretofore secret meeting, between the administration and representatives of the Taliban that was scheduled for yesterday at Camp David. And the president canceled it, announced cancellation of it, as he does most things, in a tweet. In fact, in a series of tweets. And that's really what the media has been focusing on much of this morning. Also, of course, the next Democratic candidate debate is scheduled for this week, the 12th, which is Thursday. It promises to be maybe more substantive than have the previous debates, mainly because there's only one night. There are 10 candidates on stage, and the time allotted for the debate is 3 hours. And what that means is that candidates are going to have much more time to develop their ideas, to raise questions, challenge, clarify, whatever it might be. It seems to me that there's potentially more for the viewing public to learn from this debate than there have been from earlier debates. Up until now, most of the focus on the debates has been winning and losing, who won, who lost, who held their own, who lost ground, etc., etc., etc. Focusing on that more than the issues themselves, because there wasn't adequate time to go into the issues. This particular round appears to promise more depth than that. So it's scheduled for Thursday evening this week. Also, I think it's important to remind everybody, if indeed reminding is even necessary, that day after tomorrow is September 11th. It appears to be ironic, but the more we hear about the details of the canceled meeting at Camp David on yesterday, Sunday, with the Taliban, it appears that scheduling it a few days before the 11th of September was not an accident. That there seems to be that the particular debate just a few days before September 11th offered a note of symbolism, which even prospectively would give greater attention to the significance of the peace process itself, had the meeting happened. According to the president, the reason the meeting was canceled was because the Taliban took credit for an explosion that occurred late this past week, in which 12 people were killed, including an American serviceman. And that young man's body was returned to the country and arrived. And Secretary of State Pompeo was there to greet or to accept the remains of the killed serviceman. But as is usual, what the president claimed about the origins of the meeting and its cancellation is turning out to be a little bit more involved than it initially appeared. First of all, this meeting, that it was even scheduled to happen, was known to only a few people. According to what I've read in the national media, many people within the White House did not know that this was even scheduled. Also, the lead up to the meeting, which occurred all during last week, revealed a split within the administration that I think everyone knew about over relations with the Taliban, as well as relations with Iran and others. The differences of opinion between John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Pompeo was an advocate of this meeting. Bolton was not. And now that the meeting has been canceled, from media accounts, it's beginning to become clear that more people on this one agree with Bolton than with Pompeo. Bolton believed that the Taliban could not be trusted, that the Taliban was an agency, an organization based on hate and violence, that they were responsible for innumerable examples of bloodshed in Afghanistan. And Bolton's argument is you don't sit down at the peace table with an enemy like this unless you get some assurances that the behavior of this enemy is going to change. Turns out that, and I think this has been reported before, this nation has been meeting with the Taliban off and on for a number of months in order to try to establish the ground rules for a formal negotiating session. Each side, in other words, was required to make concessions before anything further could happen. And the fact is, both sides did make some concessions, to the point that an informal agreement was signed by both sides as the backdrop for the scheduled meeting that the president decided ought to happen at Camp David. And if you think about it, obviously there were a number of issues associated with this from the president's perspective. This has turned out to be America's longest war. Won't be long before this war will be 19 years in length. And it's up until now shows no signs of ending. We know from past administrations that there has long been a desire to start withdrawing American troops from Afghanistan. Many people seemingly have gotten the message from Russia's Afghanistan experience. Russia was there for an extended period of time from the 80s on and never could resolve the issues that have been producing violence in Afghanistan seemingly forever. And then the United States took over. And now here we are in our 18th year in a war that seemingly has no end. President Obama promised to begin withdrawing American troops. President Trump, during the campaign, ran for office on his commitment to end this war and bring American troops home. But nobody has been able to do anything beyond the talk. President Trump seemingly was committed to changing that and changing it dramatically by pulling off the kind of big surprise that would really launch him into his 2020 re-election campaign. He believed, his advisors believed, that if he could pull this off, it would be a feather in his cap and would give him the kind of major success that he has been clamoring for as he begins looking toward the 2020 campaign. Obviously, the president's motives, besides bringing the war to an end and ending the bloodshed, the president's motives also are personal. And according to the media, one of the issues that seemingly began to divide the two sides as the meeting loomed closer and closer was the very nature of the meeting itself. Apparently, the Taliban was insisting that the agreement be made before the meeting takes place. In other words, the meeting would be but a celebration of an agreement already reached ahead of time. That became a problem for us. It became a problem for President Trump because it would not fulfill the promise that a prospective peace agreement would deliver to him. He didn't want the meeting with the Taliban to be merely to celebrate a treaty that had already been agreed to behind closed doors. He wanted a prospective agreement to appear to be, whether in fact it was or not, a product of his direct involvement. In other words, he labels himself or fashions himself as the ultimate deal maker. He wanted the peace agreement that came out of this meeting to be his ultimate deal. That couldn't happen if the meeting agenda was to merely shake hands and celebrate an agreement that was reached behind closed doors by other people. He wanted the public to see this peace agreement as being reached because of his direct involvement in it. According to the sources, he envisioned a meeting at Camp David where Taliban would be in one room and our representatives would be in another, and the president would be going back and forth between the rooms with counter terms. In other words, it would be a deal that he was able to pull off. That story, and there's no way to tell as yet how much that issue is responsible for the cancellation at the last minute of the meeting at Camp David. The meeting from the beginning, when it was talked about with the Taliban, was to be in Washington. Also, the preliminary meetings between our ambassador to Afghanistan and the Taliban did not include the government of Afghanistan. The Taliban has insistently refused to deal with the Afghan government, which it considers to be illegitimate. I believe I read that we had 9 formal sessions with the Taliban in previous months leading up to this. And up to this point, the negotiations were between the Taliban and the United States. And the Afghan government began to raise issues because they weren't brought into the picture at all, even though they were intricately involved in the outcome. President Trump intended to include the Afghan government in this Camp David meeting. There were reports that we would have a plane to bring the government delegation negotiators from Afghanistan to Washington for the meeting. President Trump is the one who decided that a meeting to be held in Washington should be at Camp David, because the traditions at Camp David, he believed, would be so overwhelming, so awe-inspiring, because princes and dukes and kings have resided there over the years and met there and reached negotiations there. He believed that it was a perfect backdrop for this particular negotiation, which would produce a result that was equally newsworthy. So for him, the potential for a peace treaty or peace agreement was important enough that it needed to take place in a place that was also important in America's negotiating history, which is Camp David. So all of this, if you begin to put all of these little pieces together, it seems to me, all of this was shaping up as an orchestrated reality show. It seems very consistent with the priorities of this president, with his behavior in the past, to the issues that he has consistently made clear are most important to him. So the question that we don't know the answer to yet, we may find out, is how much were these issues responsible for the cancellation of the meeting, as opposed to the bombing that killed 12 people in Afghanistan late last week. Those who support John Bolton himself, emphasized the violence, the violent explosion last week, and pointed out that it in a sense, reinforced his concern all along, that we ought not to be meeting with these people because they can't be trusted. And from media reports, it's looking like more and more of the American population, at least the public reaction to the cancellation of this meeting, the public reaction to even the idea that such a meeting was scheduled, would seem to indicate that a lot of people agree with John Bolton on this, that you need assurance from an enemy before you're willing to sit down and negotiate anything serious with that enemy. You need some evidence that your adversary is going to take an agreement, whatever it might be, seriously and adhere to it. Bolton's position is that with this meeting on the table coming up this weekend, for the Taliban to take credit for a bombing in Kabul this late in the game is to him an indication that they had no intention ever of taking whatever is agreed to seriously. And that's the argument that the president used and gave publicly for canceling the meeting. But like everything else, it seems, what seems to be may not be, because there are a lot of behind-the-scenes issues associated with this, which indicated that the reasons behind the cancellation might be a bit more complex than the president's tweets seem to indicate. This has been clearly a major issue over the weekend and has been front page news for much of this morning as well. And just as an aside, of course, this was the first full weekend of NFL football, so that's front page news as well. I'm particularly struck. I'll just make one comment on this because I don't want to get off in this direction at all. But one thing that I've noticed is that the sports media, sports talk shows, are in heaven now that football season has begun. Because the NFL, even more than college football, is big stuff. It is unbelievable that for much of the summer, conversation in the sports world has revolved around the NFL, even though practice for the fall season hadn't even begun. Talk of salaries and jumping from one team to the other. And the personalities involved in all of this. It's pretty obvious that the sports media wants to keep NFL football alive even during the portion of the year when it's not being played. But now that the season has begun, they don't have to stretch for subject matter anymore. It's there in a number of games yesterday, the first game on Thursday night, a Monday night game tonight, and then the next day or two talking about what happened the previous weekend, and then beginning on Thursday, looking forward to the next weekend. And that now will consume us up through and including the Super Bowl, the first of next year. So those tend to be the big issues. There are, however, a couple of others that I wanted to touch upon. I have three, and we have about a little bit less than 20 minutes left in this, our first hour. I'm hoping that we can do justice to these three in the time we have left in this first hour. If we don't, I'm going to save what I think might be the most significant one for last, for third. Actually, I think they're all significant. But some of them are more substantively significant than others. Let me begin with this one, because this was the topic of conversation all last week. Hurricane Dorian. Sharpie Gate, as it were. And the debate which ensued over the marking up of the map to include Alabama as a likely spot for damage from the hurricane, when in fact it never was, except for the very beginning, before we could even begin to speculate on the particular track that this hurricane might take. I was struck with the fact, by the way, that the hurricane stayed with us throughout the weekend and the weekend, that there was serious damage from this hurricane, including power outages in Nova Scotia this weekend. So rather than go out to sea, as many of these Atlantic storms are inclined to do, this one hugged the coast all the way up the coast, beyond the borders of the United States and into the borders of the eastern provinces of Canada. But there's one story. This one came out yesterday. This is dated yesterday, September 8th. The Washington Post reported that staffers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, acronym NOAA, were warned last week not to make any corrections on statements President Donald Trump made about Hurricane Dorian. That, in fact, there was an email that warned staffers and weather scientists to keep their mouths shut on this particular issue. As you know, much of the conversation at the end of last week focused on this doctored hurricane map and where the hurricane would go, and the addition with a Sharpie of an expanded path that took the hurricane into the southeast portions of Alabama. According to the Washington Post, one meteorologist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, wanted to remain anonymous, of course, said that this email urging staff members of the organization to keep their mouths shut clearly was referring to President Trump and came after the National Weather Service office in Birmingham contradicted the president last week by immediately denying that Alabama was in line to receive any damage from the hurricane. And I can remember saying last Wednesday on this program that there had been up to that point no record of the National Weather Service ever contradicting any president in the past. This meteorologist said the following: "This is the first time I felt pressure from above to not say what truly is the forecast. It's hard for me to wrap my head around. One of the things we train on is to dispel inaccurate rumors, and ultimately, that's what was occurring. Ultimately, what the Alabama office did is provide a forecast with their tweet. That is what they get paid to do." In other words, the Weather Service, by denying the president's claim that Alabama was going to suffer damage, the National Weather Service was doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But this meteorologist said, this email we got tells us that we're not allowed to participate in that process already at all, when in fact, that's our job as well. So obviously, this thing just won't go away. Why do I think it's significant? Because it makes provides additional evidence for the kind of personality in the White House that we're dealing with. The same kind of personality and its quirks, which might affect the cancellation of an important peace negotiation because certain players in that negotiation didn't appear to be going to be able to get the kind of mileage, political mileage, from the treaty that they expected to get. One would think that a treaty ending a war that's been going on for 18 years would be the most important issue in all of this. But what we see is, to some of the players, what they could get out of this process seemingly became a very important, if not the most important, consideration in all of it. I think this story about silencing the NOAA staff members from contradicting the president on the path of the hurricane is an indication that a lot of people are dealing with this administration by keeping their head down and their mouths shut. I think that's important. I think it's important for all of us to know. The second issue that I wanted to touch upon, we got a little bit more than 10 minutes left. I heard on Friday evening. And that is on the Rachel Maddow program Friday evening. Rachel broke a story which she said we had to be sitting down for before we hear it. She reported live on her program on Friday evening, quote, "This story just came out within the last hour. If you've not seen it yet," she said, "you're going to want to sit down. You're going to want to spend a little bit of time with this." And then she told the story, which was based on a headline from Politico. And here's the headline, quote, "Air Force crew made an odd stop on a routine trip. Trump's Scottish resort." And then Rachel Maddow described this as what she called an incredible scoop. And here's a quote as to how she presented it. In the early spring of this year, an Air National Guard crew made a routine trip from the United States to Kuwait to deliver supplies. What wasn't routine was where the crew stopped along the way. President Donald Trump's Turnberry Resort, about 50 miles outside Glasgow, Scotland. Quote, since April, Maddow said, the House Oversight Committee has been investigating why the crew on a C-17 military transport plane made the unusual stay, both en route to the Middle East and on the way back, at the luxury waterside resort, according to several people familiar with the incident. And then Maddow read what she called the most shocking quote from the entire story. Quote, taken together, she said, the incidents raise the possibility that the military has helped keep President Trump's Turnberry Resort afloat. The property lost $4.5 million in 2017. Revenue went up $3 million in 2018, the Politico report said. Rachel Maddow was stunned. The implication in the brand new reporting from Politico is that Trump got his money, got this money-losing resort in Florida to which he now wants to direct the G7. He's got this money-losing golf resort in Ireland, which he has already directed Vice President Pence and his entourage to make a stop at. Now, in addition, he has a money-losing resort in Scotland that was about to lose the money-losing airport that serviced it. The golf course is already having really tough times. If they lose the nearest airport too, she said. But now, miraculously, now that Donald Trump is president, American military cargo planes have started refueling at that airport at a significant price markup. Right. It's much cheaper for them to get their fuel at military bases. That's part of the reason they always stop at military bases. Also, they're the military. They're no longer stopping at military bases. Instead, they're stopping at the airport that Donald Trump needs to prop up his Scottish golf resort and paying full freight commercial airport rates for that fuel. And then they're sending the crews to go stay at the president's resort. The implications are huge. That's the story that Rachel Maddow broke on Friday evening from a report in Politico. There's a little bit more to it than that. Yesterday's Washington Post here it is. No, this is dated September 7th. So this would be Saturday's Washington Post. Addressed this issue and provided more detail, more information. The information doesn't change the importance of the story. It merely softens it a bit. It appears that the Defense Department contract with Prestwick Airport which is 23 miles from Donald Trump's golf resort in Scotland. A contract agreement between the Defense Department and the airport was signed in August 2016, during the last months of President Obama's administration. August of 2016, 2 months before Donald Trump's election in November of 2016. But since Donald Trump has become president, this report says, the stops and the checks from the Defense Department have gone up substantially. In early October of 2017 is when the contract became operative. Since that time, 917 payments for liquid petroleum have been made by the Defense Department at a total cost of $17.2 million. The Guardian broke this story early last year in 2018. And then this past Friday, Politico rebroke it, or broke it again. In June last year, Representative Elijah Cummings, chair of the House Oversight and Reform Committee, drafted a letter to the Pentagon in which he asked if the refueling stops might be politically motivated, a way to keep Prestwick Airport open in order to help drive sales at Donald Trump's Turnberry Resort. This is what Elijah Cummings' letter to the Pentagon said, quote, "The airport closest to the Trump Turnberry Golf Course, Glasgow Prestwick Airport, has been viewed as integral to the golf course's financial success. Yet it too has lost millions of dollars every year since its purchase by the Scottish government in 2013, Cummings said. Given the president's continued financial stake in his Scotland golf courses, these reports raise questions," unquote. Fact of the matter is, a night at President Trump's golf resort in Scotland runs about $380 a night. The fact that the golf course generated $23.4 million in 2014, last year rather, up from $3 million compared to 2017, raises serious questions about this contract agreement between the airport and the Scottish government and the Trump interests. This was Rachel Maddow's story on Friday night. It's an incredible story for obvious reasons. Once again, it indicates how much we don't know about the president's financial operations and behavior. If the president had separated himself from his business interests when he first came into office, as previous presidents had, none of this would have happened. The president, however, didn't do that. On paper, he turned the running of his organization over to his sons. But there has been so much evidence over the last 2.5 or 3 years that he continues to keep his finger in the pie, that he's continued to be involved in his business interest, and all the while is insistent in going to great lengths to keep his financial doings secret, lead to speculation. Now, here's a story that adds to that speculation. The fact that Elijah Cummings and the Oversight Committee have been on this since this past June, I think is an indication that oversight is underway. At some point in time, one expects that all of this will come to some sort of a conclusion. We've just gone about a minute beyond the top of the hour. I think it's a good time to break. We'll be right back. I've got two more issues that I want to share with you in our second hour. And then I want to share with you a project which I've been working. I mentioned this before last week. I want to kind of give you an update on it as well. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a short break. We'll be right back with our second hour. I hope you'll stay tuned. Thank you.
Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this second hour on this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. As I mentioned at the beginning of the first hour, today is Monday, the 9th day of September in the year 2019. Let me, right at the beginning, alert you once again that tomorrow's program, we will have a return from Kevin Shanley, who, according to an email he sent me yesterday, said he's raring to go. That'll be tomorrow at the beginning of our 1 o'clock hour. And if history is any indication, we are probably looking forward to the entire 2 hours of tomorrow's program, enjoying the comments and the information provided us by Kevin Shanley. I know he's been active. He's been sending me copies of papers and opinion pieces that he's been writing. I'm very elated about all of this because I like Kevin. And the fact that so many people are becoming aware of how valuable his insights are on this subject of the Far East, and more specifically, China. I think that many people are becoming aware of something that we've known on this program for some time. And I think it's just a wonderful opportunity for us that Kevin continues to be willing to come on the air with us and share some of his ongoing work and research. So that'll be tomorrow's program. Also, of course, I remind you that the day after tomorrow, Wednesday, is 9/11. It's hard to believe that it was 18 years ago that the infamous 9/11 attacks occurred. And of course, we've been living with the results of those ever since. Also, I remind you that the next Democratic presidential debate is scheduled for Thursday of this week. It'll be 3 hours long, and it'll occur on Thursday evening, the 12th. So this is a big week in a lot of ways. Also, I want to encourage you to take the opportunity, if you are inclined, to come on the air with us and share your thoughts, your concerns, your ideas, your suggestions, whatever they might be, related to the programs, related to the topics we're dealing with. I've raised a number of them so far in our first hour, and I want to touch upon a couple more here in our second hour. And the second one that I want to deal with in this hour is, I think, a little bit more substantively important than the others. I think all of them offer insights and help us understand some of what's going on around us. But I think the second one basically raises an issue that I think all of us had better be familiar with, know about, because I think we're all going to have to deal with it in one way or another. And it's not going to be too much longer before more and more of us are going to realize the significance of this particular issue. So let me address the second issue first. It relates to the Department of Education. More specifically, to the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. We've had comments before. We've talked about her in relationship to charter schools. I've made the comment, many people have made the comment, that Betsy DeVos was appointed Secretary of Education by President Trump, not because of what she knows, or what she's accomplished, but for what she believes. She comes from money, big money. She has made substantial financial contributions to the Republican Party and to President Trump. And she has a track record of being heavily involved in charter school movements in Michigan. That the President of the United States would appoint her as Secretary of Education, giving her oversight over the entire educational establishment in this country, is astounding. Because what she's bringing to that position are her own prejudices and priorities. And we see them as state after state is moving more and more into the charter school movement. We're into it here in West Virginia. The governor of this state just signed a law that was passed early this summer, opening the way for charter schools in this state. Just this weekend, the Charleston Gazette, our statewide local paper, good paper, reports on a secret meeting that occurred in the state capital, Charleston, this past week on Wednesday, that was held behind closed doors between leaders of the educational establishment in the state, opinion makers, members of the State Board of Education, representative of the county superintendents and school systems. Ostensibly, the purpose of the meeting was to make sure everybody was on the same page, everybody in that room, that is, on what needs to happen to give legs to this particular legislation on charter schools, what we have to do as a state, as educational leaders in this state. When the media tried to cover that meeting, they were told it was not public, it was private, and the media was consciously kept out of it. Of course, what this does is create even more concern about the implementation of charter schools in this state. Many people, myself included, who've been most opposed to the charter school movement, are concerned about it because we don't believe it's necessary. I believe, and I've said this more than once, that the charter school movement is just the latest label for an effort to privatize education and destroy the concept of public education in this country. I think that's what's at the bottom of all this. I think that's what it's all about, and I worry about it, and others do as well. When you hear about a secret meeting and the fact that the attendees at this meeting made it a point to not admit the media and to keep a secret meeting secret, all that does is lend mystery and concern to public concerns that are already there about the charter movement, about the legislation, about what's intended and why, and what this means for our children. But this particular story that was dated yesterday, September 8th, relates not so much to Betsy Voss, but her associate in the Department of Education, Diane Auer Jones. She is a senior advisor to the Department of Education on specializing in post-secondary education. She was one of Betsy DeVos's first hires. Before she came to the Department of Education, after being hired by Betsy DeVos, she had spent 5 years as senior vice president at an organization called Career Education Corporation. And I'm going to read this literally because I don't want to mess up the details. Career Education Corporation was a company in the for-profit education business. Earlier this year, in early 2019, Career Education Corporation agreed to forgive $494 million in student debt as a result of an investigation into its practices by 49 state attorneys general. In other words, 49 states participated in an investigation of this particular organization, Career Education Corporation. And the results of that investigation was that the company was required to forgive $494 million in student debt for reasons which the article described. The attorneys general concluded that Miss Jones's employer had engaged in deceptive tactics to recruit students. Among other things, the students were charged for vocational programs that did not have the proper accreditation for students to obtain licenses to work in their fields of study. The forgiven loans were for money owed to the institution. The practices in question had all occurred during the time that Diane Auer Jones was senior vice president of the company. Now she's an advisor to Betsy DeVos in the U.S. Department of Education. And just last week, on August 30th, the Education Department announced that it was making it more difficult for students defrauded by for-profit institutions to get relief from their debts by reforming rules that are known as borrower defense to repayment rules. These stem from the Obama administration. Specifically, these rules for forgiveness of loans were put in place by the Obama administration in order to relieve students of debts when the school to which they owe that debt goes out of business before the student has had a chance to graduate. These for-profit educational institutions have a bad track record of going out of business because they can't make the profit they need to make in order to stay in business. And the students that they've recruited are left holding the bag. In this case, the bag is loaded with debt. Now the Department of Education, under the leadership of these two women, has passed rules making it more difficult for students to have their debts forgiven, irrespective of what the institution might have done to warrant such relief from student debt. Increasingly, these new rules put the burden of proof on the student more than the institution. A student who seeks relief must prove that the college made a deceptive statement quote, with knowledge of its false, misleading, or deceptive nature, or with reckless disregard for the truth, unquote, unquote. Also, the student has to prove that it was this deceptive information that caused the student to enroll in that school. In other words, these new rules by the Department of Education place a burden of proof on students that is almost impossible for them to win. Not only do they have to prove that the institution defaulted on its obligation to them, but now they have to prove that the institution gave false information, that the institution knew it was giving false information, and the student also has to prove that that false information is the principal reason that the student ended up enrolling. Think about that. The department says that these new rules are going to save the taxpayers millions of dollars. But I would suggest to you the millions of dollars that taxpayers save are going to be riding on the backs of students who are going to be stuck with debt incurred to institutions that shouldn't be allowed to be in business in the first place. Both of these people, Betsy DeVos and Howard Jones, have track records in for-profit education, which indicates where their priorities lie. The institutions get their money. The students end up paying for it. Yes, the taxpayers will save money that would ordinarily be spent by the Department of Education. But the fact of the matter is, students end up paying for it. When you think about this, and then you think about it in the context of the scandal over the last several months of these wealthy people that paid inordinate fees and blackmail, doctored grades and applications in order to get their children into prestigious institutions of higher education, you begin to get a sense not only that education is in trouble, but that the people who've been put in positions of trust to make sure these things don't happen are the very people who cause them to happen. I think that's significant. And I don't want to go too far on this issue beyond that. But I think this is, as somebody whose career has been spent in education, I have to say that this really bothers me. I continue to believe that education is the answer to many of our problems in this country. But stories like this make me realize that we're a long way from providing the kind of education that success is going to require. There's one other issue that I want to deal with before we end our program today. And I really do want to introduce it today because I can't drag it into tomorrow because Kevin Shanley will be with us tomorrow. And it seems to me holding it until Wednesday would be not sensible. This was a piece, an op-ed piece in the Washington Post that was written, signed by Sheldon Whitehouse. It's dated September 6th. The subject is the Supreme Court. This one, it seems to me, is one that all of us better take note of. Sheldon Whitehouse, as you'll recall, is a United States Senator from the state of Rhode Island. And what he's talking about is politics. More specifically, the extent to which the Supreme Court has become seemingly involved in politics to a degree which, in the minds of many people, is raising questions about the legitimacy and the effectiveness of the court itself. The founders made very clear that the Supreme Court was to remain apolitical. It was not to become involved in politics, because ultimately the rule of law itself, the very interpretation of the Constitution itself, needed to be left in the hands of people who did not have political agendas. Alexander Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers he wrote on the courts, made this very clear. And I'm looking for a reference. A specific reference. To Hamilton. But Hamilton in Federalist, I believe it's 68. I'm not sure. But in one of the later Federalist Papers, Hamilton wrote about the importance, what he called his vision of, quote, the complete independence of the courts. Whitehouse claims that his concerns and efforts are in that same direction, that his ultimate agenda is to restore confidence in the court, which he argues is rapidly declining because of its more and more political nature. This is his background. He says, a few weeks ago, several of my Senate colleagues and I filed a friend of the court brief in a case before the Supreme Court in which the National Rifle Association, the NRA, was urging the court to allow continuation of its project to undermine gun regulations. The NRA was involved in a project, an effort, to undermine state efforts and federal efforts to regulate access to guns. And this particular issue came before the court. And this is when White House and his Senate colleagues filed a brief to the Supreme Court on this particular issue. And White House and his colleagues in that brief raised questions about what the NRA was doing, but most important, what the Supreme Court would be doing by supporting it. White House says, we cried foul. The response was remarkable. And it's this response that I think sparked White House to write this op-ed in the Washington Post, and sparked me to realize how significant this issue is. When White House and his other Senate colleagues filed this brief, this friend of the court brief, in this case, the court was considering, on the request of the NRA, conservative media lit up in unison, White House says. Fox News and the Wall Street Journal editorial page attacked us, accused us of court packing, something that we did not even advocate. The Wall Street Journal used language which, and this is interesting, was so similar to a separate National Review op-ed that in an unusual effort, the editor of the Wall Street Journal openly denied plagiarism. In other words, the Wall Street Journal was writing a criticism of White House and his colleagues for interfering in this issue between the NRA and the court. And in that op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal was using almost the same language as the National Review used in its op-ed. And the Wall Street Journal, knowing that it would be subject to charges of plagiarism, denied plagiarism the day it committed plagiarism. After that, White House said, all 53 Republicans in the U.S. Senate wrote a letter to the court's clerk decrying the brief that White House and his colleagues had submitted. All of it, a media uprising, a conservative media uprising to the substance of White House and his colleagues raising in public a question which obviously these media interests didn't want raised. In other words, this is the take that I had when I read this. The reaction from conservative media all around, all at the same time, in the same way, suggests to White House and to me a concerted effort to silence White House and his colleagues because they are raising an issue before the public that conservatives don't want the public to be aware of. Namely, that they believe they've got the court in their pocket. But the only way they can continue to keep the court in their pocket is if the public isn't aware that it's happening. The danger of White House and his colleagues making public the fact that the court is being dragged into political issues is in effect being forced to become a player in issues that are clearly political, is an issue that can last only as long as the public doesn't know about it. And here's the basis of the brief that White House and his colleagues filed. It's a little bit of data. The brief said the following. From 2005 through the fall term of the Supreme Court of 2018, the Roberts Court, Chief Justice John Roberts, issued 73 5-4 partisan decisions benefiting Republican donors. 73 5-4 decisions upholding the priorities of big donors contributing to Republican issues. And these are the issues. Allowing corporations to spend unlimited money in elections. Citizens United. Hobbling pollution regulations, the EPA. Enabling a tax on minority voting rights. In other words, approving gerrymandering that has been going on. You remember the case, North Carolina, the North Carolina case, where the gerrymandering was so extreme that the case ended up in court. Curtailing labor's right to organize, the Janus case. Denying workers the ability to challenge employers in court. And, of course, expanding the NRA's gun rights project. White House said it's a pattern. He acknowledges that in specific cases, same-sex marriage cases, for example, a particular justice would move over and support liberals in 5-4 cases. But the pattern of conservative pro-Republican victories in 5-4 cases, 73 times between 2005 and 2018. This occurred. In the process, he says, the majority routinely broke conservative legal principles like respect for precedent, the originalist idea of reading the Constitution, and other things that Republicans have claimed they support. But in these 5-4 partisan decisions, they're violating them. I think what bothers me as much as anything else is the issue of precedent. Because I remember the Janus decision. We spent quite a bit of time on that case on this program. And other decisions. The Heller decision in 2008 on guns. Justice Scalia's majority decision on the right to bear arms. And the fact that Justice Stevens wrote a dissenting opinion in that case, which was substantially longer than the majority opinion, the 5-4 opinion on the case, written by Scalia. Because Justice Stevens, in his dissent, demonstrated that the conservative majority on the court was manipulating the very meaning of the Second Amendment in order to reach a decision it wanted to make, which violated years and years of precedent. The same thing happened in the Janus case. You'll remember the Janus case the decision made it illegal for unions to force non-union employees in companies to pay what were called service fees for the fact that the union was representing them in negotiations and in bargaining. According to White House, the Washington Post, in its expose on black money, on big donor donations remaining anonymous, the Washington Post, talked about what it called a sprawling network of organizations funded at least by $250 million of anonymous money, spearheaded by the Federalist Society and its leader, its director, Leonard Leo. We talked about Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society before. We saw what White House says. We saw this network's hand in the confirmations of Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. This I did not know. One unnamed donor gave $17 million to an organization called the Judicial Crisis Network, which is a Leonard Leo organization. The $17 million to block the nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court and to support the nomination of Neil Gorsuch. Then a separate donor, maybe the same one, White House says, gave another $17 million to support Brett Kavanaugh. It's interesting, in the Kavanaugh situation, the NRA gave $1 million supporting the Kavanaugh nomination. And this is astounding. This is from the Janus case. We spent quite a bit of time on it, but I didn't know this. This donor network of anonymous donors lobbies the court by submitting anonymous amicus briefs suggesting to the judges how they should vote on specific issues. In the Janus case, one anonymously funded group supported 13 different amicus briefs in that one case, fighting public sector unions' right to organize. When the case was decided, it threw out 40 years of precedent in labor law in order to make illegal agency fees that unions had been allowed to collect by the Supreme Court for more than 40 years. This happened 73 times from 2005 to 2018. According to White House, the pattern is too plain to ignore. In our brief, in our friend of the court brief, he says, we warn the court of polls that are showing that the public's faith in the independence of the court is eroding. He concludes, corporate and partisan donor interests want the eyes of the nation turned elsewhere while their projects play out in courts that they have already captured. And White House believes that the conservative media eruption against his friend of the court brief was an effort to deflect attention from our concerns by suggesting that our goal is to increase the number of liberal justices on the court. Again, he points out, we never mentioned that. What we asked for was more transparency about who's giving this money. Who are these donors that are giving huge amounts to influence the court in friend of the court briefs and all the rest of it? He says this right-wing eruption of media offered no defense of why a multi-million-dollar secret influence apparatus should be involved in selecting judges and campaigning for their confirmation and filing anonymous amicus briefs. The media reacted to White House's brief for making this allegation public, but they never did anything to defend the practice. Neither was there any defense of the court systematically overturning precedent or inviting challenges to well-established legal doctrines in this country. He said what we saw from the conservative media was a howling of coordinated multiple mouthpiece misdirection that you'd expect to hear from big donors who are out to capture the Supreme Court and want to make sure that the public isn't aware of it. I think this is an incredibly important issue. It's one that at some point in time we're all going to have to deal with. Because the fact of the matter is we're all living with the Supreme Court, and we're all living with this situation right now. There's absolutely no question that many of the issues that are going on in and around the President of the United States, an effort by the House of Representatives to investigate the behavior and the activities of this president, are going to end up in court. The fact that the House's legitimate oversight responsibilities under the Constitution are being sabotaged by an administration that is urging all of its current and former staff members and employees to ignore legitimate subpoenas is going to end up in court. The refusal to turn over financial records to the House Ways and Means Committee, which is written into the code of the IRS, is clearly a violation of law that is going to end up in the courts. Something else is clear in all of this. And that is that the president and those who advise him don't seem worried that these issues are going to end up in court. In fact, you'll recall that the president himself, in an impromptu press conference in the Rose Garden, mentioned exactly this when he declared his emergency on the border, national emergency, which immediately gave him control or access to funds to build his wall, when the House of Representatives, which is responsible for spending public money in the public interest, explicitly denied funding for that wall. You'll remember the president said in the Rose Garden that this is what he projected would happen. It'll go to a lower court and we'll lose. And then it'll go to an appeals court and we'll lose. And then eventually it'll go to the Supreme Court. And there we can believe we'll get a fair hearing. Translation, there we believe we'll win. Why? Because of exactly what Whitehouse and his colleagues are alleging in that brief. That big money is influencing not only who sits on the court, but how the court rules in specific cases through anonymous amicus briefs, oftentimes being funded by the same donor. 13 such amicus briefs in the Janus case alone. And that's the 5-4. Clearly, the president believes it's going to be enough to keep him in office and out of jail. But the fact of the matter is, the president has the data, has the information, which would prove or disprove all of this. But he is not about to let any of it become public. Rather, he's more comfortable heading into court. The leadership of the House is concerned about this court issue principally because of the time it's going to take. It's going to drag these issues out to become incredibly long. This is me talking. It seems to me that once more, what White House is giving us is evidence of the need for impeachment inquiry to begin. Because once subpoenas and requests for information become part of an impeachment inquiry, then it becomes much more difficult for those issued the subpoena to ignore them or reject them, because they do so under penalty of going to jail. One significant piece of information in an issue that we touched upon earlier in this program today, namely the Elijah Cummings inquiries that began this past June on the possible connection between the military transports stopping at a hotel near President Trump's Scotland golf course and efforts to keep the airport operating in order to allow the golf course to make money and flourish. Elijah Cummings speculated in his letter to the Pentagon that might be true, and asked whether, in fact, there was any evidence to support that or to disprove that. And the one piece of evidence that I didn't mention, excuse me, that was in the Washington Post coverage of this issue, was that Elijah Cummings has reported that since he made the initial request in June, this past June, for this information, not one piece of paper, not one piece of evidence has been submitted to him in response to his request. In other words, whole departments of this government under this administration are flaunting the investigatory efforts of the House of Representatives. Duties that are spelled out in the Constitution of the United States, Article 1. It seems to me that massive stonewalling is going on, and that the only way to stop it is to launch an impeachment inquiry. Even though it's pretty obvious that if impeachment passes the House and goes on to the Senate, it'll die there. The fact of the matter is, the impeachment sign will have been hung on the back of this president as he seeks re-election. The American people would be presented with an effort for re-election by a president who was under formal impeachment by the Congress of the United States. That situation is going to make it very difficult for Donald Trump to get elected. It's going to make it very difficult for Mitch McConnell to be reelected in Kentucky as well. That in itself, those two issues in themselves might justify the start of impeachment. With that, we have less than a minute to go in today's program. So I want to take this opportunity once again to thank you. Thank you for your continued support of the program, of Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On, and to remind you that Kevin Shanley will be our guest on tomorrow's program. So please alert friends and colleagues that you feel might benefit from material and insights that Kevin Shanley is poised to share with us on tomorrow's program. I hope that all of you have a wonderful rest of this Monday. The weather remains beautiful, dry but beautiful, as summer seems to be, at least here in the East, summer seems to be hanging on as we move beyond the first third of September toward the midpoint in the month of September. Again, have a wonderful rest of the day, and everything works out. We'll see you again tomorrow with Kevin Shanley. Thank you so very, very much.